Okay, so we are going to we spent a couple of sessions looking at chapter 1, and now we are going to power through chapters 2 and 3, because as you'll see, there's not a lot of content there. This is part of this ongoing recapitulation, very selective recapitulation for this new generation that's about to go in and conquer the promised land, a recapitulation of selected highlights of the experience of the people up to this point. After these 2 chapters, we're going to get really into the meat of the book of Deuteronomy. Moses is going to be beginning to talk about the law and their need to adhere to the law. We're going to see lots of laws, and some of the most memorable passages in the Torah itself, as we'll come to the Shema and the 10 Commandments and other things. But for now, we're back on the edge of the promised land. The people are preparing themselves. Moses is reminding them of the history. So we're going to begin with chapter 2. We're on page 989, if you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash. In any case, it is chapter 2, and we are going to begin with verse 1. Right? And the way this is divided oddly, verse 1 seems to be a continuation of the last verse of chapter 1. So I'm just going to read it together, verse 46 and then verse 1. So after you remained at Kadesh all that long time, so they were there for a couple of years, we marched back into the wilderness by way of the Sea of Reeds. And yes, okay. As the Lord had spoken to me, and skirted the hill country of Seir for a long time. And then the Lord said to me, you've been skirting this hill country long enough, right? And here the Hebrew is Rav Lachem. This is an expression that we see again and again, which has a certain impatience to it. Enough. We're going to see that very dramatically in something that God says to Moses at the end of chapter 3. We'll get there. This is also the language back in the book of Numbers that Korach, in challenging Moses' authority, uses. Rav Lecha. You've taken, in that case, you've arrogated too much power to yourself. Here, the context is quite different. And here it's directed not at Moses, but at the whole people. And it is simply time to get going, right? You've been here long enough. Turn north and charge the people as follows. So this is what God said to Moses. You will be passing through the territory of your kinsmen, the descendants of Esau who live in Seir. So God is now directing them as to how they'll go. We'll have a series of battles and skirmishes now as they are about to enter the promised land. And I want to emphasize the words, your kinsmen, the descendants of Esau. So just to remind you, and if you've been following the Torah portions recently, you don't need any reminder about Jacob and Esau, because in fact it was the Torah reading this past Shabbat. But so Jacob and Esau are brothers. They have an intense rivalry. Jacob, as you might remember, steals the blessing from Esau. First, he tricks him into giving up his birthright, then he steals the blessing. Jacob runs away, fearing for his life, and will eventually marry and have children. And finally, they will come back together. Jacob, terrified for his life, that what Esau might do to him, as he had vowed to kill him. but they seem to reconcile and go on. Right? The important thing is that Jacob and Esau are both the children of Isaac, right? The second patriarch. And therefore, when it says you'll be passing through the territory of your kinsmen, the descendants of Esau, though they will be afraid of you, and this is ironic, right? Because it was Jacob in the original story who was afraid of Esau, but here Esau will be afraid of you. Be careful not to provoke them, right? So understand that they will fear you. And this is going to be a theme through these two chapters. People are afraid of you. The other nations are afraid of you because the word of what happened at the crossing of the sea has permeated everywhere. People know about it. So they're afraid of you. We're going to then see a new reason to be afraid, and that is the battle with Sihon and with Og, which we're going to come to a recapitulation. But part of what Moses is trying to do here, as he recounts it, is to encourage the people not to be afraid. They're going to have to go in, they're going to have to battle for the promised land. And so saying they will be afraid of you, right, is a way of saying you have nothing to fear. So I will not give you of their land so much as a foot can tread on, right? So I have given the hill country of Seir as a possession to Esau. So there's an interesting underlying theology, and that is that God allots land to nations. They don't just happen to have it. This is also important theologically because the book of Deuteronomy emphasizes again and again that there is only one God. There aren't other gods. But the general understanding of the world and perhaps how we see it elsewhere is that really each nation has its own God. Here we don't have that sense. We're going to see something a little like that later on in Deuteronomy, but fundamentally, God is the one. God is not only the lawgiver, but God is also the land giver. And by the way, that means just as God can give Seir to the descendants of Esau, God can give the land of Israel to the people of Israel, to the descendants of Jacob. So that's the theology here. And they're being told specifically when they go in, what food you eat, you shall obtain for money, even the water you drink, you procure for them for money. Indeed, the Lord your God has blessed you in all your undertakings, right? So these are your relatives, right? You can go through their land, but pay for everything that you take. God has watched over you in your wanderings, even through this great wilderness. The Lord your God has been with you these 40 years. You have lacked nothing. So there are two things going on here. One is you have the money to pay them, right? God has made sure that you are well protected. And so this will not be a hardship for you as you go through the land of the descendants of Esau. You'll pay for everything. But there's also this sense, and Moses repeats this, God has supported you, God has sustained you. This is not the sense that the people have had through the wilderness, at least as we've seen in the previous books, right? They're always complaining, and there's no food, and there's no water, and the manna is so bland, and how about some meat, right? There's all this sort of kvetching and complaining, even to the point of rebellion. But Moses wants to view it in a different way, and he wants them to view it in a different way. God has protected you, God has cared for you, and therefore what? When you go into this land and you fight, God will be there with you. And just as God protected you in the wilderness, God will protect you. This whole opening speech really is about encouraging the people and giving them the courage to move on to do what they need to do. Okay, so that's about the descendants of Esau, and Moses is recounting. We then moved on away from our kinsmen, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir, away from the road of the Arava, away from Elat and Etzion Gever, and we marched on the direction of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said, do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war. I will not give you any of their land as a possession. I have assigned her as the possession of the descendants of Lot. Right? So here again, God is the one who deals out land. And here again, hey, you are related to these people. You have a blood relation. And there we have to go back not to Jacob and Esau, but all the way back to Abraham. And Lot is Abraham's nephew, who he watches out for. You remember at the very beginning of the book of Genesis, he's sort of his adopted son almost, because Nahor, Lot's father, had died. So here, you're related, right? And there's also this sense now you're coming out of the wilderness, you're coming into this place, and you have real relationships. Remember that these relationships predate not just the exodus from Egypt, but the time when under Joseph, they all went into Egypt and suffered there for centuries of servitude. So this is sort of the end of that nightmare as they are coming back. And hey, look, there's mishpacha here, right? Not near family, but also God looks out for them, right? God has appointed them this land, and God looks out for them. And here also, the land of this people, right, the Moabites, right, who are the descendants of Lot, was formerly inhabited by this people, the Emim, who are great and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. So we've seen this before. There is this idea that there was this giant race of people in the area, very tall, very big, and they are counted as the Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emin. Similarly, Seir was formerly inhabited by the Horites, but the descendants of Esau dispossessed them, wiping them out and setting in their place, just as Israel did in the land that they were to possess, which the Lord had given them. So what we have here is a picture of peoples conquering other peoples and replacing them. And all of this seems to be completely normal. This is the way of the world. And what Israel is going to do, therefore, by going in and conquering the land of Canaan, is exactly the same thing that's gone on with all of these other people. Right? This is life. What's different here, of course, is that this is the land that God has given God's people, the land of Israel. There's this remarkable in the book of Samuel, where it talks about King David, and there's the story about David and Bathsheba, which isn't relevant really, except that in that story, it's mentioned at the time when at the season when kings go to war, leaders go to war, right? And there was, once the winter was over, it was the time of war. That is, it was routine for leaders and peoples to attack other peoples to try to get their land. This is not unusual. I'm emphasizing this because we have to understand the conquest of the land of Canaan as not in itself so unusual. It's sort of what happens in the world. One people is replaced by another people, and that is God's will, at least in these cases. right? God has given this land to this people or to that people. So that's the context here. I'm going to pause just for a couple of minutes to see if there are any questions or comments before we go on. Saul, go ahead. You have to.
Yeah,
unmute.
I noticed in verse number 9, number 9, Al tatsar et Moab v'al tikar bam milchama. It was a little stronger to Moab than it was to the land of Asaph.
Right. Yes. I think that the idea here is that I think you're right. It's kind of interesting in that the people of Moab are, in a sense, not as close a relative, right? You're going back to Lot as opposed to Esau. There is a sense in which I guess this is land that's very closer, in fact, to the land of Israel, and maybe that's part of it. There may be a sense here, and I'm speculating only, that the desire might be greater to take this land. So be careful not to do it. I don't know. You're making a good point, Saul. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Hannah and then Myra.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear they were told to pay with money for anything they got from those people. How is there money in the middle of the desert? I don't understand.
Okay, so
what they mean by money.
Yeah, also a good question. Let me look back. Yeah. Okay. So the translation is money, but the Hebrew is kesef, right? Which
money.
Kesef is silver, literally, right? So, we would use the word money in contemporary terms. That you go to Israel, you use kesef, but kesef is silver, and we should, I think, understand this more broadly. The people have a great wealth. Came out of Egypt with a great wealth. God has taken care of them and protected them. The idea is not so much, cash as it is you have the physical goods in order to pay them.
So all along they were carrying jewelry and whatever jewels.
They were carrying what? I'm sorry.
Those years they would just keep.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I thought, Mara, you had your hand up.
Yeah. They use credit cards. Do they know how many people, how many Israelis were involved in all this? Were they more? Yeah, sorry.
So it's hard to say. We had these censuses. We do know that a whole generation dies out in the wilderness. So lots, lots and lots, thousands upon thousands.
No, I'm just wondering if they were more than the other people that they were supposed to.
That's also a good question. It's very. You would have the sense that since they have to be encouraged so much, that they don't have overwhelming numbers. It's hard to know what to do with numbers in the Bible. They're often schematic. They'll use numbers like 600,000, which might just mean a huge number without really being that specific. It's really hard to know. And I take your point. I think that if they had overwhelming force, perhaps they wouldn't need so much encouragement. More than that, I can't say.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
These passages are problematic and interpreted in contemporary times.
I'm sorry, I'm just having trouble hearing you. Can you speak?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm a little closer. Yeah. So these passages are problematic as interpreted in contemporary times.
In what way are they problematic? I'm not saying they're not, I'm just interested in hearing.
So that people's conquering and taking over land of other peoples is just part
Yes.
of somewhat natural order.
Yes.
Provided that you can invoke God.
Yes.
Or,
So
or have some historical claim to the land.
right. So yes, from our point of view, I think they are problematic. We're looking at Putin in horror, right? I mean, and yet just taking over what he thinks he's entitled to. And in this world, in the world of the Bible, I'm suggesting that's not unusual. There is a sense, though, that what's happening is what God believes or has ordained should happen, because God has decided that these people have these lands. God's allocate, and this really goes back to a sense that there's the first Rashi, the first comment that Rashi makes in the entire Torah is, Rashi says, well, why is it that the Torah begins with Genesis? What do we need all this stuff for? And he says, to teach us that God created the whole world, and therefore God can give any piece of it to anyone that God wants. God is the owner, right? And that theology seems to be here as well. God is the one who's shaping what goes on. And yet, I mean, we're going to see this in much more stark terms, but there is this classic problem of free will and determination, right? If God is really telling this land's going to this people and this land's going to that people, and you're going to fight and you're going to get what's yours, then how much free will is there anyway? We saw that with respect to Egypt, with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. We're going to see it here also with hardening of hearts, right? So that's a conundrum that's really impossible to untangle, except to look at it in two different levels. On the level of God, these are the things that God intends. Nonetheless, human beings have to fight in order to get what they are entitled to get. And if the Israelites believe in God, they will get what they're entitled to get. Okay, I'm going to switch back and we do that. Okay, and we're going to continue just this litany of where they went and what they did. So we were looking at the descendants of Lot, and we're going to jump down to, let's say, verse 13, as God tells them to get up. This is again after they've fought these battles. They're going to get up. They crossed the Wadi Zered. They were in Kadesh Barnea for 38 years until the whole generation of warriors had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn concerning them. Indeed, the hand of the Lord struck them to root them out from the camp of the last man. This is what we already saw in much greater detail. This was the account of the scouts and how God condemned them, that generation, to remain in the wilderness for what was essentially 38 more years. When all the warriors and the people had died off, the Lord spoken to me and said, "You're now passing through the territory of Moab. You will be close to the Ammonites. Do not harass them or start a fight with them. I will not give you any part of the land of the Amorites to you as a possession. I've assigned it to the descendants of Lot." It too is counted as Rephaim country. It was formerly inhabited by Rephaim, who the Amorites call Zamzumim, a people great and numerous and as tall as the Anakites, but the Lord wiped them out, dispossessed them, and settled in their place, as he did for the descendants of Esau who lived in Seir, when he wiped out the Horites before them, so that they dispossessed them and settled in their place, as is still the case. So again and again here, this is all about don't be afraid. God is powerful. God ordained this, even though they were mighty, powerful giants. God decided they would be defeated. They were defeated. So too with the Avim who dwell in the villages in the vicinity of Gaza, the Kafturim who came from Crete, wiped them out and settled in their place. I want to mention something about the Kafturim because there is this remarkable passage in the words of the prophet Amos, where he is chastising the people. Of course, this is centuries later. He's chastising the people, essentially saying, don't think you are so special, right? God brought the Ethiopians to their land, and God brought the Kafturim from Crete, and they brought him here, and so on. So this idea that God works with other people and decides their fate is used by the prophet Amos actually in a way that runs against what we often think about, which is this idea that the Jewish people are special. They are God's special people. Because Amos thinks that they think they can do anything they want since they have God's protection. And what he's saying, hey, don't think you're so special. God has these other peoples. God also had, just as God brought you out of Egypt, they brought these other peoples out, and so on. And that idea, to a certain extent, is rooted here. Okay, so up, set out across the Wadi Arnon, I give you into your power Sihon, the Amorite king of Heshbon, and his land. Begin the occupation, engage him in battle this day. I begin to put the dread and fear of you among the peoples everywhere under heaven, so they will tremble and quake because of you whenever they hear you mentioned. So this battle against Sihon and then also against Og, which we're going to see as Moses is remembering them. These have the purpose of letting the world know that the Israelites are a force to be reckoned with, that they are to be feared. But all of this is in the run-up to the conquest of the land. So both that the Israelites themselves should feel encouraged and strong and not be afraid, but also the other peoples have been softened up, right? They know that this is a powerful army coming against them. Okay, and I sent messages from the wilderness of Kedema to King Sihon of Heshbon with an offer of peace as follows. Let me pass through your country. I will keep strictly to the highway, turning off neither right nor left. What food I eat, you will supply for money. What water I drink, you will furnish for money. Just let me pass through. As the descendants of Esau who dwell in Seir did for me, and the Moabites who dwell in Ur, that I may cross the Jordan into the land it's giving us. But he refuses to do it. We already read this story in much more detail in the book of Numbers. He refuses to do it. Why? Because the Lord had stiffened his will and hardened his heart in order to deliver him into your power. Here we have really an echo of the language that we saw in the Exodus when the people of Israel leave Egypt because God had hardened Pharaoh's heart. We did not see this theme in the book of Numbers, where this was originally described. This idea that God was making this happen, that God wanted this refusal of hospitality in order that it will justify the war that is coming, to be a kind of pretext for the war. This is new. And I think part of what Moses is trying to do here is to remind the people about the Exodus in a sense. This is the new Exodus. This is God's bringing the Exodus to fulfillment as they are about to go into the promised land. So we get this idea that the king Sihon had his heart hardened. And the Lord said to me, I begin placing Sihon and his land at your disposal. Occupy it, take possession of it. Sihon with all of his men took the field against us, and the Lord delivered him. We defeated him and his sons and his men. At that time, we captured all of his towns. We doomed every town, men, women, and children, leaving no survivor. We retained his booty, only the cattle and spoil of the cities that we had captured. From Aurora, the edge of the Arnon Valley, including the town, the valley itself, to Gilead, not a city was too mighty for us. The Lord our God delivered everything to us. But you did not encroach on the land of the Ammonites all along the Wadi Yabok, rather, and the towns in the hill country, just as the Lord had commanded. Right? There is, of course, there is something extremely disturbing about the way this conquest takes place. And that is that everybody is killed, men, women, and children. This is what the people are told to do consistently, not just here, but especially when they go into the promised land. They are to wipe everyone out. There should be no survivors. But in fact, we know, we have records that people did survive. We know, even if you look at the book of Joshua, it's very interesting. The book of Joshua in certain places say that they killed everybody. And in other places, they talk about, well, there's still these people here, and there's still these people here, and so on. So the reality does not seem to match the biblical description. But there's no getting around the fact that what's being not only depicted here, but required is a kind of genocide. The rabbis are very troubled by this rabbinic tradition, and they say there are two kinds of wars: milchemet mitzvah, which is a war that is commanded, it specifically from God, and then what's called the milchemet reshut, a war which you are legitimately allowed to conduct, but God does not command. And it is only here and in these instances that we have a milchemet mitzvah, that God has commanded this war. We see it here in the conquest as they come close to the land. And we also, of course, see it with the people of Amalek, the Amalekites, who they are told to wipe out entirely. I don't know much more to say about this, as the Bible's pretty clear. And this is part of biblical theology, and it seems to be an exception to the general rule that people should not behave like this. But I will, I'm going to open it up once more if people have comments about it. Yeah, if anyone has something to say about this or anything we've looked at, I'll take a minute, give you a chance to do it. Yeah, go ahead.
Is the genocide because the Israelites are now going to live in this land, and these people have, if they're there, they'll spur them to idol worship and things they should not be doing?
Yes, I think that's fair. We did see that kind of thinking elsewhere, but what's disturbing about it, I guess, is that it doesn't say that here, right? We had with Baal Peor, and the people were enticed away and all of that. We saw that. Moses is not mentioning that. Maybe, I mean, it's an interesting idea, because maybe then one has to say, well, if that is the reason, why isn't Moses mentioning it here? It would seem, in fact, to be more compelling in some ways, but it also means that they are a danger to you. And I think the general theme here is nothing is a danger to you. God is with you. You're going to go and do it. So perhaps that mitigates against giving the explanation, which indeed could be the explanation. Yeah, thanks. Any other? Yes, Andy.
Yeah, I think what's also disturbing, dangerous is that anybody can, any fanatic can say, well, you know, God told me to do this. And, you know, in our day, these things happen. Fanatics go and because God spoke to them. So how is that
Yes.
different in a sense? I mean, God
Well,
spoke, their God
okay.
spoke to them.
Yes. There is, I mean, we're going to see later in the book of Deuteronomy, it's going to deal with this in a way, because it's going to talk about false prophets and true prophets, right? And a false prophet is essentially someone who says God told them something, which God did not tell them. And what, so I'm going to leave that question in abeyance. We will come back to it as we look at that passage. But the assumption here is unquestionably that God spoke to Moses, right? From our perspective, you can say, well, you know, since that's not, we would say by our standards, that's not the kind of thing that God would say, because that's not the nature of God as we understand it. But back then, it was the nature of God as people understood. I don't think there was a doubt in people's minds that this is what God ordained. And in fact, when it isn't done, people are punished as a result. There is the story about King Saul, who is to attack the Amalekites, and he keeps their goods and he leaves the king unscathed, and he loses the kingship because he didn't do the whole job. Okay. So let's go on. We want to continue to march through this recollection of the march. Go ahead, Saul.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about Moab and Seir. There's no mention. I maybe I'm wrong, but there's no mention in Devarim about, you know, the wars later on that were you know, with Bilam and, you know, and
yes. So you're right. These battles though took place even in the book of Numbers. They take place later, right? But this is an extremely selective history, right? Deliberately so. We're gonna see also, I mean, Moses not only doesn't tell about some things and tells about others because these are the things that he thinks will encourage the people and give them the strength to go on and fight. But he has a particular goal here. So there's a lot of shading. Things are not retold exactly the way we've read them before, right? This is a speech. I'm not saying that Moses is lying, right? But it's, you know, any speech, right? If you want to, this is an attempt at persuasion, right? And any attempt at persuasion is going to be selective. The facts are going to be cherry-picked in order to make the point that you want to make. And I think that's why we don't see, right, the whole thing with Bilam, and it's a long story, right? And we get all this poetry there. It's just not what Moses is focusing on. Okay, so we're going to now we talked about Sichon gets beaten, and then we're going to go up we made our way up the road towards Bashan. The king Og of Bashan with his men took the field against us. The Lord said, do not fear him. I am delivering him and all his men in his country into your power. You will do to him as you did to Sichon, right? And the Lord our God also delivered into our power King Og of Bashan, all of his men, and we dealt such a blow that no survivor was left. At that time, we captured all of his towns. There was not a town we did not take, 60 towns, and so on. They were fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, in addition to a great number of unwalled towns. So this emphasis here on the fortifications of the towns, in other words, these were not easy towns to take, right? Yet we were able to do it. Why were we able to do it? God was on our side. God commanded it, we were able to do it. Don't worry, when you go into the promised land, you'll be able to do it. And we took the booty and the cattle and the spoil. We seized at that time from the two Amorite kings, the country beyond the Jordan, from Wadi Arnon to Mount Hermon. Sidonites called Harmon Sirion, and Ammonites called it Sinar, and the towns of the tableland, and so on and so forth. Only King Og of Bashan was left of the remaining Rephaim. And then we get this really interesting statement about Og, right? We know that he's one of the Rephaim. These are these very tall, powerful warriors. If you think about later on, the story of David and Goliath, right? Goliath seems to have been one of these people. That's the sort of the image. How big was Og? His bedstand, an iron bedstand, is now at Rabbah of the Ammonites. It's 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide by the standard cube. Right? So you want to know how big he is? You can go see his bed. Now, in order to understand this, you have to understand a couple of things. First of all, people didn't have, queen size beds, king size beds, California king size bed, right? They slept on little couches, right? Or what we might think of more like an army cot. Here he had this, so a cubit is the distance from here to here, right? It's the forearm of the average person. And I think if you look at the 9 cubits by 4 cubits, says the commentary here, approximately 13.5 feet by 6 feet, right? The dimensions of Og's bed are naturally larger than Og himself, for they indicate how enormous he must have been, right? So by our standards, I don't know, but in the standards of the day, I can't imagine what the sheets cost for this thing, but neither here nor there. Anyway, by the standards of the day, he was such a giant, right? And just a comment about this idea of it was an iron bed. So this takes place at the beginning of the Iron Age. Iron was rare. It was, very expensive. This is a powerful man. And some of the commentaries I read suggested his bed isn't really iron, it's decorated with iron because it's such a precious metal. Later on, we'll see in the book of Amos, again, there's references to beds that are decorated with ivory. So this seems to be something that was done perhaps. At any rate, big guy, really big guy. And this is the land which we apportioned at the time, and we get a description of who gets this land. We get the Reubenites, the Gadites, half the tribe of Manasseh, right? They get this land, and we already know this story in much more detail from the book of Numbers. There, we have this whole scene where they come to Moses and they ask for the land, and Moses checks with God, but really, because it's outside the promised land, and they're told there, yes, God says, yes, you can do it, but you have to go fight with the people. And that's what we're going to see here, but we don't get any of that imagery here. We don't get the sense that Moses is checking with God. God told me, I did it. It's all of that.
So your friend Elliot,
Moses wants to give a sense of surety,
Rabbi
strength, and I think that's consistent with not talking about is checking in and people's questions and things like that. So they got it, and we seize the Arava from the book of from the slopes of Pisgah to the east, to the edge of the Jordan, and so on. At that time, I charged you, saying, the Lord your God has given you the country to possess. You must go as shock troops, warriors at the head of your Israelite kinsmen. These are the 2.5 tribes who are given land outside. Only your wives, children, and livestock, I know you have much livestock, shall be left in the towns I have assigned to you until the Lord has granted your kinsmen a haven such as you have, and they have taken possession of the land that the Lord your God is assigning them beyond the Jordan. And then you can return to your homestead. And I charged Joshua at that time, saying, because Joshua is going to be the next leader. You have seen with your own eyes all that the Lord has done to these 2 kings. So the Lord will do to the kingdoms into which you will cross over. Do not fear. And then we get this statement, right? Ki Adonai Elohechem hu hanilcham lachem. Because God, the Lord your God, is the one who will fight for you. Don't worry about how fortified the towns are. Don't worry about how powerful the people are. God is with you. God will be fighting your battles. You will win. Okay, so that is the end of this recounting of specific events in the wilderness to prepare the people for the future, this new generation, with one exception. What we're going to see as we move ahead now, we've come to another parsha of the Torah, Et Hanan, and there's going to be a lot of talk about what happened at Mount Sinai. And about the giving of the 10 commandments, that will be recapitulated here. And this is really, we're going to see a lot of legal information. We're going to see laws we haven't seen before. But what we've seen up to now is a kind of prologue. And the purpose of it was to inspire the people, to instill courage in them, to get them ready. So let me open it up if we do have questions. We went very quickly today. The next sections we're going to do quite slowly. There's a tremendous amount of, I think, very interesting material coming up. So go ahead, Myra, I think you had your hand up. Yeah, go ahead, just unmute.
Call from Christmas B.
Hold on, I'm just gonna close this. I have 2 questions. The first is, if this was the beginning of the Iron Age and iron was so expensive, what were their swords made out of? And secondly, who is telling this story? Is it Moses?
Yes. Okay. So the answer to the second question is easy. Yes, this is Moses. This whole book is Moses talking.
Okay.
And it is different from the other books where we'll read something like, and then God said to Moses, blah, blah, blah. Here, Moses is saying, God told me, right? It's all in the first person. This whole thing, the entire book of Deuteronomy, with the exception of the last few verses where it says, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, died. Clearly, that's not what Moses said. But the book itself is a very long speech. It's all in the mouth of Moses. As to what their swords were made out of, great question. I have no idea. I really don't know. I mean, they had copper.
Yeah.
I do know that. Whether they were made out of copper, I don't know. Clearly, they didn't have steel. I don't know. Saul.
Rabbi, in one of the Psalms that we say every morning, Le'esor malchehem b'zikim v'nichdehem b'chavlei barzel. There's your iron.
Yeah. But here we don't have it.
Okay.
Right. So, I mean, the question is really a question for archaeologists, right? Pre-Iron Age, or certainly when iron is rare and expensive and new, what were they using? I just don't know. It's a great question.
I have a question, Francesca. Actually, it's something you were talking about before about the idea about false prophets. And it wasn't until after you went on that I realized what I also wanted to say about it, which is, I'm a psychologist, those of you who don't know me. And I also think about where is the place when you talk about false prophets, and God told me about people who are having command hallucinations and think that they're one famous religious person after another. That also has to be considered.
Yeah, I'm not clear on the question you're asking.
More talking about false prophets, and God told me to do this, and that's why I'm doing it, and all the crazy behavior that happens around it. There's the extremists, but then there's also the people that are
Yes.
completely psychotic, that are having command hallucinations, telling them to do one thing or the other, and they really believe these things. They really believe they are Jesus Christ, or whoever they think they are, Muhammad, or I don't know.
Right. So I did mention this earlier. The Torah clearly believes that there are false prophets. Right? That is to say, they're not false prophets in the sense that they are prophets of another God, right? But rather that for their own reasons, or perhaps because of their own mental illness, though the Torah doesn't really talk about that, they're telling people things that are not true, right? They're not true prophets. And one of the challenges, and we're going to see this later in Deuteronomy, is how to distinguish. One of the classic ways to distinguish.
It's a great question.
Right. It is a great question. One of the classic ways to distinguish is not really helpful, which is if the prophet tells you something will happen and it happens, then they were a true prophet. But you don't know that until later. So, and you need to be able to know when they tell you.
What about all the time, the false positives?
What about all the false
Right.
prophets?
Yeah, what about the false positives or the false negatives? If you do
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true
square.
too. Yes, yes, right.
Could have just been a lucky guess.
They
And
could
it could
just
be prophecy.
right. They could just be lucky, right? They prophesy something and it happened. There's the book of Jonah, right? Jonah is told to go to Nineveh and to prophesy against them and tell them that if they don't repent in 40 days, the whole city will be destroyed. And he doesn't want to do it. And one of the reasons, it's very unclear why he doesn't want to do it. He runs away, he goes in the opposite direction from Nineveh. And he says later on to God, I ran away because I know that you are a merciful God. And in the end, you're not gonna destroy them. They'll repent, you'll accept it. So I didn't want to be part of that. And part of it, in a cynical way, you could argue is, hey, I'll look like a false prophet. I will say in 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed, and then it won't be destroyed. And that won't be good for my reputation. It's interesting there, however, that what does Jonah say? He says in 40 days, the city of Nineveh will be overturned, which is understood as a kind of reference to an earthquake, right? That's what will happen. But of course, the city is overturned in that it repents. The entire city changes, overturns itself, goes on the right path. But the question is, there aren't great answers to this question. Another answer which is given is if they tell you to do something which is contrary to the Torah, they are false prophets, right? So we have that definition also. But to come back to the comment, I think, Francesca, that it's hard to say. But our tradition maintains that not only is Moses a true prophet, but, there never was a prophet, and assumption is never will be one like Moses. Moses is the prophet. We're going to see later on in the book of Deuteronomy that he is different from other prophets. Other prophets do not see God directly, as it were, like one person to another. And I'm not talking visually here so much as have the direct line, getting the purest message, right? Other prophets who are also legitimate prophets don't see God as clearly, right? So from the point of view of this tradition, which has lasted now thousands of years, right? There is an assumption borne out by the life of the people that Moses is actually what he claims to be. If there's anything else, I'll take it real quick. Otherwise, okay, so next time we are going to pick up with a new parsha. We'll be looking at chapter 4 and really in significant detail. And I hope
Have
to
to
see
go
you
further
all.
along.
I did make a recording and I will be sending it out. And I hope you can, if you want to go over it, you can go over it and let people know about it so that they can access it. In the meantime, have a great week. And I will see you next Tuesday at 11.